Are you ready to manage your work and personal world better to live a more fulfilling, productive life? Then you've come to the right place. Welcome to Productivity Cast, the weekly show about all things productivity. Here are your hosts, Ray Sidney Smith and Augusto Pinaud.
Welcome, everybody, to Productivity Cast, the weekly show about all things personal productivity. We are back with another action-packed episode of Productivity Cast. I have with me on the show today Augusto Pinaud, Francis Wade, and Art Gelwicks. We're going to be talking about productivity and the need for speed. You know, I'm a New Yorker, as some people know, and as a New Yorker, I'm frequently told that I speak really fast, and I tell them that I just am more efficient with communicating. But you know, what's really interesting about this is that I think that there are different ways in which, at least in English, people tend to see language being communicated faster or slower. For example, the British speak faster than Americans. They tend to think Americans speak very, very slowly with a drawl. And I've always been curious about the sort of linguistic cultures that have developed because of that. But today, what I really want to focus on for us all is really the importance of speed in a productivity system that one is developing. What are the issues that we tend to encounter when we do go for speed over, say, any number of other things? It could be quality, it could be aesthetics, it could be functionality, and then finally, for us all to talk a little bit about our own techniques for getting more done in less time, using speed techniques in our own productivity systems, and where we might have some positive consequences and maybe some negative ones as well along the way.
Good morning, everybody. This is Augusto Pinaud, and I want to mention a couple of things. One regarding the language and one answering your question. I am born and raised in Venezuela, and we Venezuelans tend to speak really, really fast. Years ago, I married a lady from Mexico, and in Mexico, people speak Spanish, but it's much, much slower, to the point that if I talk to my parents and I get home and I speak with my wife, she can know when I had speak with my brothers or my parents, because she said that my speed increased tenfold. So I still think it's a matter of efficiency. If you don't understand me faster, you just need to pay more attention. But I may be in agreement with the New Yorker here.
I did study Spanish underneath the Colombian woman, so I must fall into that category of very, very slow Spanish.
No. Spanish should be speaking faster.
It's funny because I go to the other extreme. I may live and have grown up outside of Philadelphia, but my family's all from the South. So conversations with my family, when you get going, they can take a half hour just to get one thing across. Because once you add that drawl in and you start to wonder why those Northerners are fast and why are you talking so fast, and just relax, then things just take forever.
But that said, I sadly, in productivity, we tend to try to apply the speed at the wrong time. And what I'm trying to say with that is, people don't think about speed up their productivity they only think about speed up their productivity when they feel overwhelmed, or they feel their list has grown up, or they feel that the amount of stuff they need to do is more than what they can handle. That is the moment where people start considering speed up their productivity. And in my experience, what I have been able to coach and teach people, that is exactly the moment to do the opposite, to do the most counterintuitive thing you can do, that is slow down. And the reason is simple. You still have the same amount of 24 hours that we know it's not 24, it's more like 16. And when you try to speed up, what happens is unconsciously you tend to grab the long-hanging fruit So you feel that you are crossing out of your list more items. The speed is not about what you are crossing, but how many of them are you crossing? How fast are you trying to get to have a clean slate? And when you reach those points, when you are overwhelmed, when your system has too many, and that you feel you are in a negative spot, that is exactly the moment to do the countering tough stuff, that is slow down. Because basically now every movement or every task that you pick has a much bigger impact than when you have time, when you are not having any of those feelings. That is the moment where, in GTD terms, you may need to do a weekly review every day. You may need to look at your list, 2 at a time and pick 2 things and then reevaluate after those 2 things are done. And as I believe your system needs to be able to allow you to speed up, I also think people tend to speed up at the wrong moment.
I'd agree, and I think that in order to get to a point of use a running analogy, you need to accelerate to a point of speed, which means you need to go slower before you go faster, right? You don't go 0 to 60, or in human running speed, 0 to 15 miles per hour as an elite runner out the gate on the gunshot. And I take this sort of concept of need for speed and productivity from a more broad perspective, which is to say that many of the people that I come into contact with, they are suffering from procrastination and distraction and overwhelm and all of these various productivity inhibitors and topics that we'll cover over the course of time together. But the big problem for me is that most of those things go away when people start recognizing that they're going to die. And not to be morbid here, but the reality is that, you only have so many years on this planet in this particular life. So why would you waste it? Why would you squander that time? And I think there's an immediacy, there's a sense of urgency that I unfortunately had, a brush with death when I was 8 years old. The idea of spending and enjoying and taking advantage of every moment of life, it just seems to be a part of my fiber now. And I wish that every person could experience that sense of passion to be productive. While I don't recommend everyone to have a brush with death early on in life, I do think that sense of urgency is really something that's very important to wanting to get things done. And it's not necessarily for me, productivity isn't about getting more done in less time, but it's getting the right things done in the right amount of time. And the idea that you don't have a sense of forward momentum for life in general, I think is really key in either detracting from your productivity, and then the antithesis being a beneficial advantage to it.
People who have an experience of not having enough speed or being slow, part of their experience comes from making too many errors, which means that they're doing the same thing over and over again, or they're trying to repair a mistake they made. Like, for example, they did a task and they didn't do it properly the first time because they weren't totally focused on it, or they scheduled the task and put it on a list, didn't get to it, and then had to scramble at the end. My sense is that sometimes it has to do with people's not executing the right task at the right time. And as a result, they end up sort of just before the deadline having to rush. It goes back a little bit to what Augusto said about wanting people to slow down in order to accomplish more. I think the most accomplished people don't have this sense of being in an emotional rush because they're better organized. So for me, having to rush is a byproduct of not being as organized as you could be. At least that's how it works in my own experience.
I always look at it as the fact that I need to slow down just ever so slightly to let my logical, rational mind take hold and do some planning, assess a situation, do some planning. identify what needs to be done from that plan, and then I can run off. Do you find that people who procrastinate and then sort of go up against a deadline, do you feel like they are stuck in an emotional state and therefore can't engage their logical, rational mind when they get to that place?
Yeah, I think it's if you go past the word procrastinate and just look at their practices and their habits. So if they have a habit of jumping into work first thing in the morning, for example, it doesn't occur to them that they're procrastinating on anything. They're working hard. No, what they're not doing is that they're not planning. So that takes them up against a deadline and causes a problem. But it's not that they, in their minds, that they're doing anything wrong. They could feel as if they're working really, really hard. So it's not so much a matter of procrastination or even of doing anything wrong per se. It's that there has to be a period of time if you want to be extremely productive in which you are engaging your rational mind, as you said. It's better if it comes earlier in the day than later. That's, I guess, a general principle. But if you don't have the habit, then you wouldn't even know what you're missing. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. And I want to add to that, or make emphasis on something really important that Francis mentioned, is because it's so counterintuitive what we are discussing, people think, oh, but if I work hard, then it will be better. Or if I stay late, then it will be better. Because there is a problem in general. Again, it's one of those counterintuitive things, okay, in productivity that people think. If you ask 100 people right now, will you have more time tomorrow? The majority will answer a resounding yes. And it's a lie. No, you will not have more time tomorrow unless you start blocking time today. If you want to take 2 weeks off in October, you are late already to take off for that week. Otherwise, the amount of things you have, the amount of agreements you have made are already most likely going to run over those 2 weeks. And that's a premise where things are giving you a problem to begin with. The other thing is, I'm going to start working more. Yes, but the problem is as you start exhausting yourself, you are much, much or more or less effective. When I wrote the 4 a.m. book, that was one of the arguments I discussed. As an old member of the OWL Club, as I used to call it, okay, read the people who start working at 11 p.m. and then stay until 3 a.m. I did that for a long time until I discovered, but if I go to bed and wake up at 4 when that needs to happen, what happened is between 4 and 6, I can accomplish 2 or 3 times what I used to be able to accomplish 11 to 3. And the time is irrelevant. When I wrote that book and put the title, a lot of people came and said, well, I will not wake up at 4 a.m. Doesn't matter. Wake up at 5. The argument is figure it out how you are going to manage your energy, because that's a big element of a speed up. Speed up has nothing to do with crossing more stuff out of that list. It's about crossing faster the right things on that list. And that requires, from my perspective, 2 things. One, that you have the right amount of mental energy. Because if you are exhausted, you cannot tackle the important things. The important things is not put water on the plant. The important things is define about merger. Unless you have mental energy, you will not be able to do. And second, on those times that you need to speed up, not only you need mental energy, but you need to have a much, much tight control about what is on your system than when you have time. When you have time, no problem. You can pick 3 tasks that are wrong and then, hey, doesn't matter, I will do the next ones better. When you don't have the time and you are on those levels, on those moments that you need to speed up, every task you pick is against another one because you don't have the time. So you need to pick wisely. And the only way to pick wisely is to be really aware of everything that is on your system and how picking task A will affect the other options that you have.
It's interesting when we think about the time management piece. And time is constantly referred to as one of the finite resources we have. We've identified that as we've talked through this. But there's a term in the consulting space, in the management space, that you'll hear called utilization. And utilization is often used as a measure of effectiveness of specifically related to billable time if you're in a consulting type of role. I like to use the term effective utilization. When you plan out based on the amount of time you actually have to get work done, which is the first problem that people get into, they overestimate that number. They then fail to think about how much of that time is then going to be effectively utilized to accomplish the tasks they need, and then plan things accordingly. So, for example, if we go back to what was mentioned earlier, where we think about things like out of a 24-hour day, how many of those hours do you actually have for execution of productive tasks? Well, if you take your 8 hours of sleep off, which you should, because everybody needs their sleep, then you take off another 8 hours of time not work related, just from a planning purpose, because you need time in the morning to get things up and moving. You need time in the evenings for your own things. You need time for your interactivities and your social activities. So now you're down to a block 8 hour time period. Well, how much of that is actually effectively utilized? You can track through it. You can track all the starts and the stops you have. But what normally happens is when you start to do that, all of a sudden you start to realize that, oh, wait, I have 5 hours maybe out of a given day that are effectively being utilized to get work done. Now, that normally will result in a panic. Oh, my goodness, I need to work longer. I need to work harder. I need to increase that number. And my argument is very simple. No, you don't. Increasing that number does not increase the effective utilization. All you're doing is spreading it out. What you have to do is you have to define your processes and your systems to take maximum advantage of that time that you've designated as productively utilizable time for your end goals. It does take some tracking and it takes some planning, but it also takes some personal honesty. When you look in the consulting space, often you'll hear utilization numbers of like 75%, 80%, 85%. Those are typical measures used on consultants to say how much of that time is billable to the client you're working with. Well, if we look at that for our own perspectives, if we're working at, let's say, 80% utilization of our productive time, and it's an 8 hour time block that we're thinking about, well, we're really only talking about 6 hours of those end goals. If we don't do that, we'll always overestimate the amount of time we have. We'll underestimate the amount of work we need to do. The two will be in conflict. And the thing that will suffer is all of that incredibly valuable personal time that is outside of our work time.
That's actually one of the reasons why I so heavily have adopted the idea of the unschedule, which is from The Now Habit by Dr. Neil Fiore. And I will put a link to a video tutorial that I actually have created for people to use the unschedule to identify their available hours and what discretionary time they actually do have for this kind of effective utilization. So much appreciated on that level in terms of those thoughts. I wanted to shift our conversation toward some of the issues we encounter, and I think we've started to actually already discuss that, but I wanted to talk a little bit further about this topic and of what issues we encounter when we go for speed, and then close out with the discussion about what techniques we use in our own systems for that. So I'll get started just very briefly with my concept of the quality over quantity perspective, which is to say that, as Augusto was talking about a little bit earlier, leading off of Francis's thoughts, my big concern is that there is an impulsivity when it comes to human nature, which is that the short-term rewards tend to feel larger than the longer-term rewards, and they also tend to have less effect on us in terms of increasing the good endorphins, right? whether that be oxytocin, dopamine, and serotonin, and so forth. But the reality is that we have to really fight that urge sometimes to go for speed when the quantity of what we're doing is not necessarily the most effective toward the quality of the outcome. So we need to really think about that, and it's such a broad philosophical approach. I really do think that people sometimes think that they need to work really hard now on something and then do nothing afterward, or wait a period of time, the procrastination that Francis was talking about, and then work really hard toward the deadline or near the deadline, and in the end the quality of what you've done is actually much lower than what your standards are. But they're built by all of these false assumptions, false premises that you are somehow doing better work closer to a deadline than if you had metered it out and really shot for quality.
There's actually research done on that very same question. There's one study that I read that correlated students' grades with how much work they did closest to the deadline. And as you can imagine, students who waited until the last minute performed more poorly. That's sort of just kind of obvious to anyone who's been to college and tried to study a whole lot to get good grades. But there's another study that I read. I actually wrote a report which is based partly on it, and it was written for project managers, and it had to do with how well a project team member budgets his or her time. And this researcher compared 5 different methods. I can't quite remember all of them, but there's some people who start early and then finish slowly, people who do nothing in the beginning and leave it all for the end, people who work at a constant rate, people who start slowly, peak in the middle, and then end slowly, and then people who start early and then at the end they ramp up to the end. And they compared the different kinds of productivity of these 5 people. Very interesting study, and it showed, as you may expect, people who started early were the most productive, and the ones who left it for the end were the worst people to have on your teams, because you never knew what you were going to get until they were just finished at the end. So there's some evidence that the early planners are more productive, and they certainly are less of a pain in the butt to the other people that they work with.
A secret to that, Francis, is that I actually, when I assemble a new team, at work, I will frequently ask people their work styles and how they normally get a project done. And I usually use the example of, so you're in a group, study environment or a group project in university, and who are you? Are you the one who, doesn't respond to people and gets, stuff done at the last minute? And I give them the opportunity to be as honest and transparent as possible in that environment. And that way those people can get the first deadlines and, sort of get the experience of being successful. Because I genuinely believe that if you are that kind of person, you likely had childhood experiences, adolescent experiences that taught you that being smart trumped hard work. And there's been quite a bit of research on this, right? The idea that if we could tell children that they're smart and that their IQ is the ultimate arbiter between success and failure, then hard work is a testament to their stupidity. So if you are that kind of person and you've been hearing all your life that, you're smart, then you see hard work as, me being stupid. And that's not true, and it needs to be quashed in your own mind. And giving people those little kinds of successes helps to start the process for them to be able to know that quality can be done with hard work over time and come out with a successful outcome on time. And I find that to be a productivity technique that really, really helps.
In a speech, I gave a speech on this topic to the PMI a couple of years ago, and my advice was basically try not to get the Try to get the good ones. In a nutshell.
That's great. That's great.
It's something like what you just did. You try to assess what style the person has, and unknown to them, when they tell you their style, you can figure out how productive they're going to be.
That study that you mentioned it's quite interesting. That if we are referring to the same one, at least, and there is a book, and of course, the book escaped my mind right now. That is quite interesting by Carol Dweck and his team of researchers on this topic, because it applies, also to us growing up. Because, like it or not, we have been on one side or both sides of that equation. As I said earlier, we tend to think that we are going to have more time tomorrow. And that is a big problem. It is a big issue, because if we assume that we are going to have more time, that also assumes that we are going to be able to do more, and we're going to be more effective, more efficient. But also, as Art was saying earlier, there is a percentage of that utilization that we can do, and there is a percentage after that point that you're not going to be possible to. Sorry, you're not a machine. If you come and tell me, well, that's great, and the next 3 weeks I need to perform at 135%, well, good luck. It's not going to happen, okay? And because we think we are going to have more time, when we try to do those things is when we are drowning. And if you're drowning, and instead of trying to move faster, you try to relax and float, you have less chance to drown than if you are instead trying to now move your arms and legs much faster, because what you do while doing that is consume much energy, much more oxygen, much more everything. And the same thing happens in productivity. Right? When you now go and say, oh, I need to speed up, and now I need to do 70 tasks a day. Yeah, that's a beautiful theory, except that probably the only way to do that is that you pick out of those 70, most of them, the majority need to be long-hanging fruits or no brain related, because there is no other way to do that. So that is a big issue, that then we tend to think on speed, on quantity. And the reality is that the relationship quantity-speed, it's not the real thing, because if you select out of your system and delete all those things, you are anyways going to have the same issues that were causing the problem to begin with. Low-hanging fruit things, I don't care if you have 900 of them, are not going to produce that high level of anxiety that is making you think, oh, I need to hurry up, I need to speed up, I need to be faster. Are the same, the number of those, it's much smaller, and they tend to be hidden between your system. So if you delete all those things that you think you can do faster in the name of quantity instead of quality, you anyway are going to end up with the same things. So it's much better to stop or slow down significantly so you can identify which ones are those and then move them up so the system can, again, start moving and working.
You're right on the money with that, Augusto, because when you think about how much can you increase to get greater productivity, there's a point of diminishing return. You always have to look at the balance of quantity and quality. I mean, when people ask me what productivity actually means, I will typically answer that it means doing the right things at the right time in the right way. And if you want a visualization for this, picture making a meal. There are steps that you can do while you're cooking a meal to make yourself more efficient, doing all the prep work and everything so you're ready to cook and those types of things. But certain things take a certain amount of time to happen. You cannot make them go any faster without diminishing the quality of the end result. And you have to take that into consideration. So understanding where you can increase your velocity without diminishing the quality at the back end is really one of the key tenets of productivity. You can't increase everything. It just won't work. But there are key areas that you can isolate and say, oh, okay, I could get more efficient here, I could get more efficient there, and have more time available for the other parts of it. But we really need to get ourselves away from this mindset of doing more means we're being more productive, because there isn't a causality there. We need to make sure that we are doing the right things at the right time in the right way to be able to get to that quality of end result that will make the difference for us, ourselves and other people, whether it's at work or at home.
You just defined on the back end there are the penultimate definition of busyness in terms of just doing things for doing's sake, as opposed to doing the right things at the right time with the right resources. There are so many more factors when it comes to being effective that I think sometimes people look to efficiency, and not that speed is one, I presume, form of efficiency we can talk about, but the idea behind it is certainly sound. I think that people shouldn't look to doing a bunch of tasks that might be taking you in the wrong direction, by the way. You could do a lot of work in the wrong direction instead of understanding what direction you should be headed, finding that productive compass, and then going due north effectively as needed. I want us to shift gears now in how do we utilize some speed techniques in our own productivity system, and where do you sometimes feel like you have dramatic gains because of it, and perhaps some of the potential shortfalls from doing so?
For me, it's a matter of two things. So there's two things I use as let's call speed techniques. One, as I said, is I do review more often. When I start feeling, call it overwhelm, or the need to speed up, or those things, the first thing for me is go back to a review stage, because I understand that if I get in all those feelings that I need to speed up, meaning I have more tasks than the time I have to do them, I need to make sure that every task I pick is the best possible task for the conditions I have on that moment. So on that moment, I tend to go almost task by task. A top thing that I tend to go is three tasks at a time and no more. So I go to my system, pick three of them, and I start just focusing on those three. And sometimes I do one, and after that one is finished, I say, oops, I need to recalibrate, go back to review. Let's call it technique number one. The second one that I do is I tend to do what I baptized years ago as the extraordinary hour. The extraordinary hour is basically a time a week where I just go and think. I don't work. I don't work on my list. I'm not trying to accomplish a lot of things. I'm trying to think. And I have discovered that when I am on those moments where I feel I need a lot more speed, thinking, it's much more effective for me than try to knock things out of my list. So when that happens, I tend to add or force that time to think. And I understand from an outsider perspective, sometimes people may have come to my office and look at me like, I thought you were really busy, but you are looking at asbestos right now. And I say, yep, that's exactly the reason I'm looking at asbestos, is because I'm really busy. And it seems completely counterproductive. But what has happened is sometimes you look at your system and say, I need to solve problem A. And you're thinking, solve problem A to a way. And after you spend some time thinking, you say, oh, you see, I will have done these three tasks to solve problem A, when if you do it this other way, you do a much more permanent solution. And it's when, for me, spending time on that thing that I call the extraordinary hour is so useful.
For me, I have a sort of a strange answer, which is I don't do anything. No, why would I say that? It actually gets to something that you had said before, Ray. You're asking about the emotional experience of wanting more speed. I find that if I find that I think I need more speed, I'm usually wrong. That really what I need is something else, kind of along the lines of what Augusto said, which is I need better planning. Because if I feel as if I'm falling behind, it may seem as if speeding up will help me to catch up. And usually in my case, that's not true. It usually is a function of something else, like I'm not planning enough, or I'm not planning my calendar accurately enough. It's what I'm planning is way off of what I'm actually doing in reality. So the symptom, which is that I'm falling behind, isn't solved by looking for more speed. Looking for speed is, in my case anyway, a bit of an error, because it's not the answer to the problem I'm trying to solve. It may seem that way, and at some point in my life, I think it was, but where I am right now, maybe with some more gray hair and a little more experience and some wisdom, that it's more sort of what Augusto was pointing at, which is sort of stepping back to think. We've all been saying this, stepping back to analyze and think, what is the best intervention to make? And for me, it's nowadays, it's never a case of wanting more speed. It's usually never the answer to whatever unwanted symptom I'm experiencing. Now, having said all of that, there is a whole nother angle I thought I'd throw in, which I think is important, that I do, and is that I travel. I noticed this when I used to travel back to Jamaica from the US. What I would have to do is mentally change my headspace. I'd have to slow down, because the pace of life in Jamaica is much slower than it is in most parts of the US. And there's a great whole line of study on this. There's one article, one piece of research done on comparing the pace of life between 6 countries. And they compared 6 things for developed and undeveloped countries. Japan is in there, US, Indonesia. They measured how fast it takes to get a transaction done at the post office, how fast people walk in the cities, and the third one was how accurate are the public clocks, like the clocks you'd see in a clock tower. And sure enough, Japan was sort of like the clear winner. People walk the fastest, the transactions are the shortest, and the public clocks are the most accurate. And here in Jamaica, I can tell you, we have a problem with all those 3 areas, and the problems have been going on for years. So what traveling does is it shows me that there is ways to be more productive, and that my own culture can often be an impediment. And if I don't travel enough, I actually can sense myself getting stuck in sort of a pace that if I don't travel, I would never escape from. Those are a couple of things I do.
If I think about the process that I execute, probably the most important one, and it kind of stems off of previous casts, is the resetting of my activities, getting back into that cycle of right thing, right time, right way. I have to mentally stop and say, okay, I've now devalued my time because I'm working a lot harder to get things done that shouldn't take that level of hard work. However, and I'll echo what you were saying earlier, Ray, there are times that working smarter, with air quotes around it, doesn't actually get the work done. There are times where you actually have to work hard to do it, and you have to allow time to execute that fact. And often that's a procrastination point. Yes, I'm really going to have to sit and crank these widgets for the next 4 hours to get this accomplished. There's no fancy macro that I can write. There's no code piece I can download from the internet. I'm just going to have to do this work. And being able to set that expectation for myself and assign a value to the time I'm about to expend to do that helps me understand a little bit the importance and reprioritize the importance. On the flip side, just as a thought that occurred to me, one of the things you have to be careful of, if you look at something you're doing and you're constantly able to cut pieces off of it and trim it down and streamline it and make it that much more efficient, and you have to wonder, well, why was I doing it so hard in the first place? Why was it taking so much time in the first place? Is it that's how I received it and I was just acting on it the way it was given? Or did I not give myself the planning time, as has been mentioned on the call already? Did I not give myself the opportunity to think about this? And we really don't spend enough time in that creative process analysis, giving ourselves the valued sharpening of the saw in this particular case, making sure that we're going to be efficient where we can be efficient. So for me, I always have to back up and say, okay, what's an hour worth? And is this worth spending that our currency on, and how can I get the most from my value?
The most speed-oriented thing I do is dealing with inboxes. And I think the technique that really helps me, a little bit of I think this is a practical approach type of technique, and is to be able to centralize my communications as much as possible. What do I mean by that? What I do is I force almost every type of communication into my email inbox. And you'll say, oh my gosh, you're crazy, Raymond. But hear me out. The reality is that if you have a voicemail box where people leave voice-based messages, I don't know, maybe some people listening on this think this is a strange concept, but people still do this. They leave voicemail messages. And I have those forwarded to my email inbox. I have text messages forwarded to my email inbox. I have email from all of the various email accounts that I have for work and personal life. Faxes. These are paper documents people put in a machine, and then it scans a digital image of it and then transmits that over telephone lines, and then that shows up in paper printed on the other side. I know, again, this might be a very foreign thing to some of our younger listeners, but people used to do this instead of just emailing a PDF. And so I actually have a fax to email service that sends documents to my email as PDFs. And what this does writ large is that it creates a one as few places for me to have to process. And I use the FIFO method, which is first in and first out. So I reverse my inboxes so the oldest stuff shows up at the top. And then I just power through the things from the top to bottom. And that allows me to deal with all communications as much as possible, all communications, including scanned mail, so as mail comes into my office or other places, they are then digitized and then they're emailed into my inbox as well. So I'm able to deal with those things in the most efficient manner for me, which is I'm used to and very comfortable with processing email. So just a thought for those folks, it can feel overwhelming at first. And so for those who might try to implement this, you really do have to think through the approaches, creating your own set of rubrics for how you're going to deal with different types of material all coming into a centralized space, right? So I'm not going to deal with that fax coming into my inbox the same as I'm going to deal with an email, but the same things apply in the sense that you either need to respond to it or you need to do something and then respond to it. And then you sort of create that umbrella. I mean, starting at the top, which is, this is not useful, this is not actionable, and I can just delete it, right? And then, oh, this really has something that I can respond to immediately. Great, I can respond to that right now. And then finally, I have something that I need to respond to. I need to do something first and then respond, maybe perhaps with that outcome. And so therefore, that's going to be track stacked and maintained so that I can go ahead and continue processing my inbox. So I just use that premise of being able to centralize as much as possible all communications so that I'm not looking in 40 different places. And this, of course, has the failing that there are a bunch of chat apps now. Facebook has Messenger, WhatsApp, and every social network has its own private messaging tool, so you have a bunch of inboxes in all of these types of places. You can't get all of them centralized yet, and I hope that we do get to that point. But as much as possible, I really do try to centralize. We are now at the top of our showtime. Do you have any final thoughts before we close out?
Yeah, we need to finish the show so we can speed up in productivity.
I don't know. I think our utilization numbers are probably pretty high today, so I feel good about that.
Me too.
Yeah, same here.
That closes out another episode of Productivity Cast. I am glad we had this conversation about speed. I hope you all are. And here's to your productive life. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Be well, everyone.
That's it for this episode of Productivity Cast, the weekly show about all things productivity, with your hosts, Ray Sidney Smith and Augusto Pinaud.